Good evening, and welcome to the Marion Miner Cook Athenaeum. My name is Michael Grauske, and I am one of the Ath Fellows here. When we talk about solutions to the problem of human trafficking, we generally think in terms of broad, wide-sweeping policy decisions, perhaps made by national governments or international organizations. Especially when the crime has a cross-border element, this makes sense. An inherently international crime ought to be addressed through international governance and policy. Nonetheless, human trafficking is also a local phenomenon in that it directly affects individuals and communities, and local officials and advocates are sometimes in the best position to respond. Here tonight to discuss her experience combating human trafficking at the local level is Maria Trujillo, a graduate of CMC's class of 2001 and the Human Trafficking Program Manager at the Colorado Department of Public Safety. Ms. Trujillo joined the department in 2014 after spending 6 years as the executive director of the nonprofit organization United Against Human Trafficking. In 2012, she was recognized for her work combating human trafficking as a Circles of Change honoree by the nonprofit organization Building Bridges for Peace, and in 2015, she was recognized as the Table Talk honoree by the University of Houston's Friends of Women's Studies. Ms. Trujillo graduated with a degree in international relations from Claremont McKenna in 2001, and she obtained her master's degree in international communications from American University. Tonight's talk is sponsored by the Magrublian Center for Human Rights. As always, audio and visual recording is prohibited. Please join me in welcoming Maria Trujillo to the Athenaeum.
All right, good evening, and thank you for the honor of allowing me to come back to campus and give this talk. I'm here to, as said in my introduction, to discuss how human trafficking is addressed on the global level. I have a decade plus experience in the anti-human trafficking field. I'd be a lot richer if I was involved in human trafficking. Instead, I'm a government employee addressing and countering human trafficking. So to start today, here's my little map of my journey to the human trafficking field, and that's a very common question I've been asked all today is how does one enter the anti-trafficking field? How do you get involved in such a difficult and complex issue? Well, here I am starting at Claremont McKenna College and graduating from this great institution, and then I went off to get my graduate degree at American University, and seeds were planted along the way. I learned about human trafficking for the first time in 1996 when I was a high school student and studied the use of sweatshop labor by multinational corporations. The term human trafficking actually didn't exist at that time. There weren't laws on human trafficking, so it was just kind of a soapbox issue for myself, and I would bring it up in many of my IR classes about how we should be anti-Nike and Gap, and we should be addressing this issue. And after my time at American University, I had the opportunity to study abroad in Japan for a year. And it was during that time I got the opportunity to travel to places like in China and Vietnam and Thailand and Cambodia. And that was when I really came face to face with what I saw as human trafficking. I saw many vulnerable people being exploited in the sex industry. I saw young boys and girls begging on the streets of Cambodia, and that is when I really decided that I wanted to try to make a difference and address that issue. And so I returned to the United States and moved back to DC, and my day job was working for an international development organization who recruited healthcare professionals in developing countries. But in my spare time, a friend of mine and I decided that we wanted to find a way to impact this issue. We wanted to contribute to our community in some form or fashion. We wanted to make a difference. And we wanted to make a difference on human trafficking. So we Googled, is there a group or an organization or something in the DC area addressing this issue? And lo and behold, we found a meetup group called DC Stop Modern Slavery. And it was a group of average, everyday citizens from all different walks of life coming together, wanting to make a difference on this issue. and wanted to find a way to make an impact as community members. And so we studied the issue, we researched, we talked with NGOs working on the issue, and we worked side by side with people like Kevin Bales, who wrote some amazing books about human trafficking, Brad Miles, who is now the CEO of Polaris Project and runs the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And we discussed how we can make a difference in the DC area on human trafficking. And I did that for 2 years and had kind of an epiphany and saying, I'm going to make a huge shift. I'm going to change my career path because this is what I want to do. This is what I'm passionate about, and I want to do this full time, but I also want to pay my bills because I had some student loans that I had to pay. So I put that call out to the many contacts that I've made working on this issue as a volunteer, and lo and behold, someone that I met in Houston was looking for an executive director for a startup nonprofit called United Against Human Trafficking, and said, hey, if you're really serious about working on this issue in human trafficking, how about moving to Texas? I was like, I don't know about Texas. I'm from Colorado. Kind of have a thing against that. But I knew that I put that out there, and that's what I wanted to do. So if I was going to really do it, I needed to take that leap of faith and pack all my belongings and move to Texas. I got the job, and I made that leap of faith and moved to Houston to run the nonprofit United Against Human Trafficking. And I thought maybe I would do that for 2 years. I bought all IKEA furniture so I could cut and run at any minute. You never know about Texas. You might want to get out of there as soon as possible. But instead, I was there for 6 years and made some pretty incredible changes and impacts in the Houston community, which really led me to the opportunity to be able to move back to my home state of Colorado and be able to be part of designing a comprehensive and collaborative plan to address human trafficking for an entire state and set policy around the issue of human trafficking. So that just gives you a little summary of my path. There's, Texas is in there. And to be running and overseeing the Colorado Human Trafficking Council. And now let's talk about what human trafficking is and what it's all about. The best place to start is the definition. What is human trafficking and why is this issue important? Well, it's a market-driven issue. There's a supply and demand. Victims are forced, defrauded, and coerced into providing labor services or provide services within the commercial sex industry. The other thing that's really important is that human trafficking is a human rights issue. It's someone's basic dignity and freedom is robbed from them. And what I like to talk about is human trafficking. You all made a choice today to come here today. It's a very good choice. It was a positive choice to be here. But you made that choice. You decided to come, enjoy this wonderful meal, and to hear me talk. When you're a human trafficking victim, those fundamental everyday decisions, those basic human rights that we all kind of take for granted, those basic opportunities for choice are robbed from you. You no longer have choice or agency over your own life. That's what it means to be a human trafficking victim. And one thing that's important to remember is that human trafficking doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's part of a broad spectrum of exploitation, and it's at that extreme point of exploitation where we find human trafficking. And human trafficking, unfortunately, it is a global issue. It is happening in every single country across the globe. It's happening here in the United States, and it can happen to anyone that you can imagine. There's no one victim profile. One thing that we're noticing in public awareness is that people think that human trafficking is happening. They understand it to be some form of modern-day slavery, but they don't think it's happening in their backyard. They don't think it's happening next door. I just met someone in Pomona who's working on a human trafficking task force. That is in our backyard. That is next door to where we're standing right now. And I think that's really important change that we have to make, is make people aware that it happens in our restaurants, it happens in construction sites that we pass by, it's happening at that massage parlor that's open 24 hours a day, And it's places that we see and pass by on a regular basis but may not notice what's happening. The other thing that's really important to understand about human trafficking is that it is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and criminals are flocking to become part of the human trafficking industry because unlike drugs and arms dealing, you could exploit a victim of human trafficking over and over again. When you sell drugs, you earn money once when you sell that dime bag. When you sell a revolver, you only earn one set of money. But when you sell the services of a victim, a human being, I could come to you and sell my human being to you. I could go over here and sell my human being. I could go over to the back and sell my human being. I've just earned 3 times the profit that I would ever have earned selling a revolver or selling my drugs. And criminals are understanding that because it's a low risk, high reward crime because it's not being investigated at the level that it needs to be. And it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. There's a lot of money to be made on the services that human beings can provide. So this is my one stat slide. And I have only one because everyone asks for stats and numbers. I will start by saying understanding the prevalence of human trafficking is incredibly difficult because human trafficking is a highly underreported crime. Many victims do not self-identify as victims. They may not understand that they're a victim or may be afraid to report. And it's hard to take a census of human trafficking. You don't have human trafficking victims saying, hey, I'm right over here, count me. That's not happening. So everything on this slide is an estimate of some really good research that is out there by the International Labor Organization about the prevalence of human trafficking. So first we have 20.9 million people are estimated to be in some kind of forced labor. 68% of that is in the labor trafficking. 22% is in sex trafficking. There's a common misconception that sex trafficking is actually the larger piece of that pie. And when you look at this research, it actually shows that labor trafficking is the much bigger piece of the human trafficking pie. The other thing that this research shows is that it estimates that 55% are female and 45% are male. So there's an actual parity around female to male ratio pretty much. Again, another common misconception is that this is a woman's issue. This is a crime that affects children and women primarily. And actually what we're seeing is it's pretty even. And when it comes to adults versus children, we're seeing that 26% are involved in human trafficking if you're a child, with 74% being adult. And when we talk about the economic side and the profits, it is $150 billion profits annually. $150 billion. That's more than Google, Starbucks, McDonald's. It's a big industry. And 99 billion of that is made with sex trafficking. So although the number of victims is much lower, the profits are being made primarily in sex trafficking. And then finally, the number of victims identified globally, which is in FY 2015 was 77,823. That represents only 0.4% of the victims in existence. So we're not even identifying 1% of the potential trafficking victims out there in the world. We're actually doing a pretty lousy job at identifying victims. And so that's a big piece why I think these kinds of talks are incredibly important, because we all play a role in helping to push that forward and identify more trafficking victims. So I would love to say that in the United States we were immune to this crime. We don't have a problem with trafficking because we live in the land of the free and the home of the brave. And unfortunately, I can't say that because the United States is not immune to human trafficking. We not only have a problem with victims being brought into the United States for the purpose of trafficking, but we also have a problem with our own US citizens and legal permanent residents being victims of this crime as well. We have foreign nationals who are being brought in on a variety of legal visas, tourist visas, student visas, marriage visas, and a variety of work visas. We also have foreign nationals who are undocumented workers who are vulnerable to this crime. And that's all forms of trafficking, both labor and sex trafficking, and both adults and children. So that's what we're seeing in the United States. Next, I will have a short video that illustrates far better and in a short amount of time what human trafficking looks like in the US from survivors of trafficking. So I'm going to play that now.
My trafficker was my husband. There was no way I could reach out to anybody for help.
We're scared. We're scared to run. We're scared to tell anybody what's going on.
It was an incredibly violent situation. I felt like there was no way I could get out.
Human traffickers can be just about anyone from any walk of life. A lot of the trafficking involves domestic servitude, hoteliers, restaurant owners, owners of massage parlors, agricultural farm owners.
It can be a trafficker who tells a woman, I want to be your boyfriend, I love you, and if you love me, you're going to go out and have sex for money. It can be kind of psychological like that, or it can be more overt and more physical. It can be hitting, abusing, keeping them away from any support systems.
Trafficking, it doesn't know any boundaries. The victim can be male, female, transgendered, anyone. And it happens all over America.
I still see this attitude of it's just immigrants or it's just people in other countries. It happens to U.S. citizens so much more than people are aware.
The natural stakeholders in this issue are certainly law enforcement, legal advocates, social service providers. There's other players involved as well.
It is important to engage the community because victims often don't self-identify. They don't come forward to law enforcement.
Thank you, bye-bye.
Citizens in the community are the eyes and the ears.
It's medical workers, it's educators, it's personnel at homeless shelters.
We can't do this alone. No one has the capacity to provide every single thing that a victim or survivor of human trafficking needs.
There has to be a support system within the community, psychological counseling, shelter, and vocational education so they can reintegrate, become a healthy individual.
There's an intentional effort to get everyone together so we know how to share resources, we know how to work together, and to make sure at the end of the day, a victim becomes a survivor.
I like that video because it showcases the variety of trafficking survivors. It's both male, it's female. There are individuals involved in labor trafficking situations as well as sex trafficking situations. There are foreign nationals in that video. There were US citizens. And actually some of the male victims were victims of sex trafficking. I think that's also a common misconception that males can't be victims of sex trafficking, and they often are, and we're actually seeing more of an uptick of identifying male trafficking, sex trafficking survivors in Colorado. And also just kind of illustrates the number of stakeholders that are necessary to develop a comprehensive plan to address human trafficking. So with that, let's discuss how human trafficking has been addressed in the United States, and it really falls into kind of 5 major buckets. We have a variety of laws, both at the federal and state level, to address human trafficking. We've seen a major push around public awareness, although many argue there's a need to be more public awareness. We've also seen a lot of human trafficking being addressed through training of frontline professionals. And then we have obviously the need for victim services, and then collaborations that are happening in a variety of ways across the country. When we talk about laws at the federal level, kind of the hallmark law around human trafficking was the Trafficking Victims Protection Act that passed in 2000. Of course, we had the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery, and we had the Mann Act that happened, but really in 2000 is when we established a holistic and comprehensive law to address this modern day form of slavery and human trafficking. That law has been reauthorized in 03, 05, 08, and in 2013, and is actually up for a reauthorization process this year. That reauthorization process is actually incredibly important for people in policy and for those who work in the anti-trafficking space, because it provides us the opportunity to tell our legislators what necessary changes need to be made to the law, how can we address the issue more fully, what lessons have we learned from the field, and they bring that into the fold when providing the Reauthorization Act. Another major piece of legislation that has passed recently was in 2014, which is the Prevention Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act. This is a very fundamental change in that it is now, at the federal level, it is requiring state human services to actually be responsible to identifying, addressing, screening, and providing services for child sex trafficking victims. So really putting the responsibility on human services departments where that wasn't necessarily a responsibility before. They are also required to report within 24 hours an incident or a suspected incident of human trafficking. So this is quite a difference in the approach to child sex trafficking. In 2015, the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act passed. It was a large omnibus bill that had a lot of different elements in it, but some of the major key pieces, one, it actually changed the definition of sex trafficking at the federal level, adding two really important verbs to the definition of patronizing and soliciting, which now allows at the federal level to prosecute the buyers of sex trafficking under the sex trafficking law and statute. The other thing that it did was allow for advertisers to be held culpable and responsible for their part of human trafficking. So this is very much like the Backpage type advertisers who advertise adult services within their websites. As you might know, California sued Backpage after a major report that was issued by Congress, and they are actually being sued in Florida and another state right now for their role in advertising potential sex trafficking. It also had a lot of elements around training. One element that it had was it's now required for all TSA personnel to receive training on human trafficking. It had a bunch of other things in it too. This is the basic definition of human trafficking as written in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, basically saying that human trafficking is a crime involving the exploitation of someone for the purposes of compelled labor or commercial sex acts through the use of force, fraud, and coercion. That's a real key 3 words that really defines human trafficking amongst all the other crimes out there. So force, fraud, and coercion are the elements that you need to prove in a human trafficking case when you're trying to prosecute that. And the Colorado law and many other state laws very much mirror that same language. Another key element to the Trafficking Victims Protection Act statute is that if you are a child under the age of 18 and you are involved in the commercial sex industry in any way, you should be seen as a victim of sex trafficking. You do not have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. You should automatically be seen as a sex trafficking victim. So that's a really interesting caveat that they have. They do not have the same caveat for labor trafficking. And at the state level, there are several different types of laws that have been passed. Primarily is the criminal statute. So in every single state in the US, there is a criminal statute on human trafficking. Texas and Washington passed the first state laws on human trafficking in 2003, and Wyoming was the last state to pass a trafficking law in 2013. Another major trend on the laws is safe harbor laws. This is a form of protection for child sex trafficking victims who might be charged with prostitution. It basically provides immunity against prostitution or prostitution-related crimes for children involved in the commercial sex industry. There now, as of 2015, 37 states had some form of this law on the books to protect children. And we're seeing a lot more of those types of laws being passed. In Colorado, we had a very highly contested debate about safe harbor laws and provided a set of recommendations to the legislator on what kind of safe harbor laws would work, or what form of safe harbor law would work in Colorado. Another type of law that is also getting a lot of traction is vacator laws. Vacator laws allow for some kind of remedy for someone who has been charged with a crime as part, and they're engaged in that crime because of their trafficking experience. It has been primarily focused on sex trafficking. So if you are a sex trafficking victim and you're charged with prostitution or some related crime, there should be a remedy for your record to be expunged or sealed or wiped away, because it's a major hurdle when you are trying to rebuild your life and you have a criminal record and you are unable to get a job, get an apartment, open a bank account, or anything that requires some kind of background check. It makes it very difficult. So those vacator laws are a way to provide some kind of remedy. New York State was the first place to pass a vacator law, and it was specific to sex trafficking. Florida passed the first law that covered both labor trafficking crimes as well as sex trafficking crimes. And we've seen about 15 other states provide some form of vacator law. And currently, there's been a bill introduced to Congress this year to provide a vacator type law for federal crimes that trafficking victims might have committed during their trafficking situation. Some interesting laws that have happened in California is one is the Transparency in Supply Chain Act. It was the first kind of law of this kind to really put companies on the hot seat to investigate their supply chains and provide information to the public about their supply chains and how they're getting their goods and services all the way down to the farm level or factory level. And it's only for businesses above a certain threshold, and only if you do business in California. Didn't have a lot of teeth, but it was definitely a first step in trying to address human trafficking from the business side and really asking companies to be more responsible for their own supply chains and where they're obtaining their goods and services that they're offering to the community. This actually has had a ripple effect, and the United Kingdom just passed a law last year that's very similar. And so now there's a requirement for any businesses doing business in the United Kingdom as well as California, some major markets for companies. Another interesting law that passed here in California in 2014 is the Foreign Labor Recruitment Law. This requires labor recruiters to register with the state of California for any type of labor that they're recruiting for, not just agriculture, but for janitorial services, hotels, tourism, recruiting for McDonald's, whatever it is, and they all have to register with the state of California. And one of the things so this is really a way to help address labor trafficking more effectively. And one of the really positive things about this type of law, it allows California prosecutors to have precedents to sue labor recruiters in the state of California, where before they didn't have that opportunity. So this is an interesting way to address labor trafficking. When we talk about public awareness, I think it's one of the first steps of any comprehensive plan to address human trafficking is that you have to have the community at large to understand what is human trafficking and how can they play a role in identifying and providing assistance to human trafficking victims. We have seen several federal campaigns take hold. We have the Department of Homeland Security has their Blue campaign. The Department of Health and Human Services and their Office of Trafficking in Persons have the Look Beneath the Surface campaign that they've been running, and Department of Justice, Office of Victims of Crime, have their Faces of Human Trafficking campaign. That's actually where the video came from that I just showed you. We also have states establishing statewide campaigns in addressing human trafficking more at a state level. I think Virginia did a really interesting campaign where they actually used geo-mapping of if you were in the vicinity of a truck stop and you used your phone, they would have an ad that came up that talked about sex trafficking and how bad sex trafficking is. So they used, kind of very Big Brother, but they used your location, your GPS location, to offer you information about sex trafficking if you're in the vicinity of a truck stop, which is really interesting, or a rest stop of any kind. So very interesting and innovative way to do a public awareness campaign. We also see community and local campaigns happening. In Houston, when I was running United Against Human Trafficking, we had a campaign every single year that I was there. So we did 6 years of public awareness campaigns. And why they're really important is when I started in Houston in 2008, there was very little understanding and knowledge about public awareness. And during my tenure, we actually saw an over 300% increase in the number of calls and tips about human trafficking to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And Houston now the hotline receives most of their calls from Houston, more calls than any other city in the country. So this is really about the power of public awareness and really bringing the issue to the forefront, and that's really the results of that. To show you a few of these campaigns, these are 2 federal campaigns. Over here we have the OVC campaign on your left, and on the right we have the Look Beneath the Surface campaign from the Department of Health and Human Services. This is an actual statewide campaign that took place in California and was in partnership with CAST, which is a organization that addresses human trafficking in LA. This is a campaign that happened in New York City, and they really wanted to provide the silhouette and not be really specific about sensationalizing who is a human trafficking victim. And they had a really interesting way to talk about human trafficking. One of the things that they said that was a disservice is they asked people to call 311, which is kind of their information line, like, I want to know about, dog groomers and other things. And so it wasn't really a great place to send people. But nonetheless, it was a good campaign besides that. This is a campaign that happened in the Bay Area that focused primarily on child sex trafficking. And I really liked the positive messaging that it used in this campaign. And really, it was a campaign geared towards the victim. Not a general public awareness campaign, but really trying to speak to potential victims and that they have a chance to get out, and here's a number to call. So a really unique approach to addressing the issue. So training trends, there's some really interesting work. Again, with public awareness, you can't just do public awareness and that's it. You have to couple public awareness with training. And if you don't, you're not going to have a lot of success in the types of tips that you get around human trafficking, because it's not enough to just see those posters. You really need to know a lot more about the issue to be successful in identifying and responding to human trafficking. So that's really the importance of training. Law enforcement is a #1 place where you should do training. Texas actually created a mandatory training for law enforcement and wrote it into law. That was a sea change in Texas. Before, we struggled to be able to find opportunities to train law enforcement officers on how to investigate human trafficking. Once this law passed in 2009, I started getting calls from law enforcement all the time. So it was interestingly written. It required all peace officers going through the academy to receive a 4-hour training on human trafficking. And then it required anyone who's already in the field, an officer, to receive a 4-hour human trafficking training if they wanted to get their next level of licensure. So it didn't catch everybody, but probably about 80% of law enforcement in Texas. And we got calls from the Houston Police Department, which is one of the largest police departments in the country, and we actually trained the entire police department. So even though they didn't have to do that, they chose to make that decision and get everyone trained. It took us about 1.5 years, delivering trainings 3 times a month to about classes of about 100+ people to actually train everyone in that police department. So it's really interesting just how this kind of law can have ramifications like that. In Connecticut, they actually just passed this law last year of a mandatory training for all hotels. So when you're getting your new employee orientation in Connecticut, you are now required to receive, I think, a 30-minute training on human trafficking, and it actually has to be in your personnel file. And they have to keep those records for, I think, 7 years in Connecticut to prove that they're training all their personnel on human trafficking. In Ohio, they've actually established a mandatory training requirement for state employees. And so it's not just law enforcement, but building inspectors, the health department, anyone who might be in a position to potentially identify trafficking. So I think that was really interesting. We also find that there is a lot of training that is driven by NGOs and communities, and it's also a lot of federal funding that is provided all across the country to fund training initiatives, and really showing that is a major part of a response to human trafficking. So victim services is obviously a major component to human trafficking. Some of the questions I was receiving today was around what has been the main response around human trafficking? Has it been more reactive, or has it been more preventative? And my answer is that we've been spending the vast majority of the last 17 years being very responsive to human trafficking, which is important. When you have victims of crime, you want to make sure that their needs are being met and that the services are being provided and that justice is being served. We haven't done a lot of great work around the prevention side of things. We're working on it, but we have kind of two major funding sources for services, our federal funding sources for services. We have the Office of Victims of Crime, who provides a good amount of funding for service provision, as well as the Department of Health and Human Services has this per capita funding stream, which is really unique. It's really designed for organizations that already have a established program, a victim services program, maybe not specific for human trafficking, maybe they have a domestic violence program or immigration services program, and if they come across a human trafficking victim, they have this specific stream of money to provide service for that individual, which is why it's called per capita. In terms of victim services and just kind of the trend that within the anti-trafficking field is that we really started in 2000 with a focus on foreign national victims and labor trafficking victims. That was really the focus of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And then about 2008, 2009, we started seeing a push towards the focus on domestic minor sex trafficking at the expense of focusing on labor trafficking and foreign nationals. We're still kind of in that peak of really focusing on domestic minor sex trafficking, but there's now becoming, hopefully, this push to kind of correct that, that pendulum swing and create this balance of really covering and focusing on all victims of human trafficking, regardless of them being US citizens or foreign nationals. Now, collaboration is an incredibly important part of human trafficking and addressing human trafficking, but it actually wasn't until 2009 that this has become crystallized in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. They added this fourth element of partnership into the law in that year. In 2010, the Trafficking in Persons report that is put out by the State Department had this huge piece on the importance of task forces and collaborations. And so they come in different ways. We have task forces that are funded by the Department of Justice and the Bureau of Justice Assistance. And that was a primary focus on funding law enforcement task forces. So bringing various law enforcement agencies together at the federal, state, and local level to address human trafficking as a combined effort. In Houston, they've actually physically co-located and worked side by side in the FBI office. And so you had Houston Police Department, you had FBI, you had Homeland Security, you had the Sheriff's Office, you had all these people coming together, to work on these cases and investigate, because they all have different tools and opportunities to assist in an investigation. At the height of this funding stream, there was 42 funded human trafficking law enforcement task forces. Unfortunately, at this time, there's only about 13 funded law enforcement task forces across the country. So that's been diminished quite substantially. They also shifted to not just focus on law enforcement specific task forces, but established this enhanced collaborative model where they required a multi-sector response. So in that funding stream, you were required to have a law enforcement partner and a victim service provider apply for funding together as a joint effort. So really showcasing that the vital importance of having both law enforcement and victim services working together side by side, and showing that the need for both, and that you will not have a successful investigation if you don't have victim services working together in stabilizing your victim. And you also are not going to seek justice for that victim if you don't have law enforcement and prosecutors investigating and prosecuting that crime. So it really is a joint effort, and so that's that change that really was important. We also have state-run initiatives like the Colorado Human Trafficking Council. We have about 20 plus states who have some statewide, state-run human trafficking initiative, and they all have a wide variety of mandates and different kind of compositions of people involved. I was involved in the Human Trafficking Prevention Task Force in Texas, which was housed in the Attorney General's office. It was passed through legislation, but it was not funded at all. So there was no funding attached, no fiscal note. It was put onto the portfolio of someone who already worked in the AG's office, who already had a bunch of other projects that they had on their plate. And so it was very interesting how things were addressed. We met once a year, and we put out a report and worked on kind of task force type stuff over conference calls. A very different approach has been taken in Colorado, which I'll talk about, but that's just an example. I actually just established a national compendium of state-run anti-trafficking initiatives to really try to bring together all of that knowledge and be able to learn from one another about how we're addressing human trafficking across the country. And so we're not reinventing the wheel, but actually learning and sharing the promising practices that we've been utilizing in our different states. There's also a lot of alliances that are happening internationally and across the country to bring people together. And then we have grassroots community groups like my meetup group in DC that have lots of different places and are really important as well in the anti-trafficking space. So what's happening in Colorado, kind of using it as a case study, maybe a role model for human trafficking programming. So some unique factors in Colorado. One, we're a rectangle. That's different. We don't have a really cool shape. You know, they have those necklaces that have different state shapes. We're just a rectangle. It's really unique. Another real interesting factor that kind of blew my mind coming back to Colorado is that we are a state-administered, locally run state. What does that mean? It means that the state agencies, the state government agencies, sets the policy for an initiative, but it's up to the local counties to implement. And they have total local control on how they're going to implement that policy. Is your head blown away? It's challenging. There are 64 counties in Colorado, so 64 different ways policies can be implemented. On the one hand, there's a positive because it's really addressing the different elements that every jurisdiction has. You know, how you do things in a rural community that's primarily agriculture is going to be very different than how you implement policy in a very urban environment like Denver. But it also hurts my brain to try to figure out how things are done in 64 different counties. We also have a strong urban-rural dynamic. People on the western slope in Grand Junction do not want to hear how you do things in the Front Range, and where the vast majority of the population actually lives in Colorado. So there's this Front Range versus non-front versus the rest of the state dynamic, and rural communities that everyone knows everybody. So that's a very unique and interesting dynamic to traverse. We also have tribal lands. We have Ute tribes here in the southwest corner of our state. That adds another element. How do we engage or not engage and work with tribal communities? We welcome California to recreational marijuana. I'm really glad that you passed that law because I'm tired of the crazy growth we're having in Colorado. Lots of people are moving there. which goes to my last point. Recreational marijuana has played a role in human trafficking. We have a big 420 event. There's been trafficking stings related to that 420 event. We have an influx of tourism coming to our state for the purpose of recreational marijuana that adds an element to trafficking. People are coming. They have a lot of tourism, so why not bring a lot of potential trafficking victims to that new demand for fun and exciting things to do with edibles and other stuff. So good luck, California, with dealing with that. It's an interesting thing. I've been enjoying not smelling marijuana while I've been here. Just a side note, you know, smelling marijuana on a regular basis might be in your future. Exceptional growth has happened in our state. Some of it is because of recreational marijuana. Some of it is like, I think the secret's coming out that Colorado is a pretty amazing state to live. We have like these really beautiful mountains. We have lots of great skiing. We actually don't have that much snow, despite what people think. I think people are understanding that we've been lying for a really long time about the cold weather, which adds another element and difficulty to addressing human trafficking. And we're kind of in the middle of the state, and we have a major international airport. We have a lot of really professional, we have lots of professional sports, you know, Super Bowl winners, things like that. That adds an element. We have, you know, conventions happening in our state that brings potential human trafficking. So we have all those elements playing a factor in Colorado. Another thing that's happening is that the anti-trafficking field in Colorado is growing, and it's going bananas. We have all of these different local organizations popping up and grassroots organizations addressing human trafficking. So how do you bottle that enthusiasm and make sure people are on message and saying the same thing and addressing the issue in a comprehensive way while still maintaining their own element of local control and understanding their own communities? So most of these anti-trafficking groups have been established in the last 3 years. So it's major growth in the anti-trafficking space in Colorado. And beyond that, we have these state and regional collaborations that are happening. We have this Colorado Network to End Human Trafficking, which is a state-run hotline. We have the Department of Human Services addressing human trafficking. We have law enforcement task forces that are working on this issue. So we're getting really busy in Colorado. So it's a ripe moment in Colorado to be addressing human trafficking and having this Colorado Human Trafficking Council. So what has been the Colorado legislative response? So in 2006, Colorado passed its first human trafficking statutes. They didn't do a great job. They had language about a bill of sale, and it really kind of looked like a law that was more around our historical understanding of slavery. And so juries had a really hard time convicting people on human trafficking on our old statutes. We had only 3 state convictions from 2006 to 2014, and one was like in the process of being overturned. So this was a bit of a wake-up call in Colorado. Maybe we're a little late to the game of human trafficking, but we benefit from that because we're able to survey other states and the federal law and create a new and improved human trafficking statute in 2014 with HB 14-1273, which very much mirrored the federal law and used the same kind of elements of force, fraud, and coercion. A lot of the same verbs were being used, which is always really good. And we've had a lot of success on that law. In the first 2 years of the law, we had 42 case filings of human trafficking, and in 2016 we had 51. I think that's even more than most states. So it's pretty significant to see that big jump, and we're getting really good convictions as well. One guy just got convicted of human trafficking and his sentence was around, 254 years or something like that. So that's pretty amazing to see that change, where we only had 3 convictions before, and now we're getting 250 years on human trafficking. So that's really exciting to see. And also, this new law established the Human Trafficking Council, which is a statewide council of 31 representatives from a wide variety of sectors, and has set forth a number of mandates for the council to address, and gave me a new job. So thank you, Colorado taxpayers. So innovations with the Colorado Human Trafficking. One is the funding. So as I mentioned in Texas, it wasn't funded. It was an unfunded mandate. It brought some people together. They did some really interesting work, and they got a lot of different laws passed, but it's hard to do substantial work without having staff and funding involved. In Colorado, we have that funding of the council. I have myself as well as 2 other staff members, and we actually have funding to do different things where hire consultants, to put together campaigns, develop training programs, and the support of a department. The legislative mission is very unique in Colorado, and the composition as well as the mandates. This is our legislative mission that was written by the legislature for the Colorado Human Trafficking Council. And you could see that it was really about bringing together a wide variety of leadership from both community-based groups as well as statewide anti-trafficking efforts. They wanted to really establish and improve comprehensive services for victims and survivors of human trafficking, and assist in the successful prosecution, and to help prevent human trafficking. So they're actually using the word prevent in their mandate, which is very unique, to not just focus on the reactive, but also that prevention side. And the composition of the council is actually written in law. It's written in our statute. And it says that you have to have 31 members, that the membership shall reflect, which means we have to, the representation of urban and rural, and to address kind of that dynamic. It also had to have a balance of expertise from both government and non-governmental agencies to address the issue of human trafficking. So really trying to balance that out as well. And we have representatives from law enforcement, human services, prosecutor. We have a representative from the Defense Bar, various government agencies, NGO service providers, victim advocates, these regional and citywide human trafficking task forces that are being established by the community, so making sure we involve the community stakeholders, representation from rural communities, faith-based organizations, academia is involved, and there's a seat for an academic institution on our council. And also, we really benefited from the lessons learned in making sure that we have survivors of human trafficking on the council. There are 2 seats for a survivor, one a survivor of labor trafficking and another a survivor of sex trafficking. Understanding that we shouldn't be making policy on a victim population without involving and having their voice as part of that discussion. So that was a really important lesson learned that was instituted in the council composition. And another unique thing for the Colorado Human Trafficking Council is that they actually gave us a lot to do. The legislature didn't just say, oh, come together and do whatever you want and provide us some recommendations, which actually is some of the mandates of other councils in other states. They actually gave us a long list of things that they wanted the council to do, everything from establishing standards for victim service providers, to implement a public awareness campaign for the state, to develop training standards and curricula for frontline professionals who are in a position to identify trafficking victims, to identify best practices for the prevention of human trafficking, to collect data relating to the prevalence of human trafficking and the efforts of law enforcement, and also to pursue funding opportunities, which is helpful to do, so you could do more work. So it gave a lot of, a very long to-do list for the council. Some of those results in work products. So last year, the council established a core human trafficking training program for the state, and we're now going to be implementing that across the state, so we have a common language and a common understanding about human trafficking. We're in the process of developing our statewide public awareness campaign, and then some of it is providing report information back to the General Assembly about the prevalence and the incidence of human trafficking in Colorado, and actually having an entity looking at all those data sources and doing some analysis about that and trying to figure out what are the gaps in the data that we have and how can we do better about having a more holistic understanding with the data and addressing issues through looking at the data. That wasn't happening before. So lastly, I'm going to leave with you some challenges and opportunities in how we're addressing human trafficking at the local level. One of the big things that I've seen in the anti-human trafficking field over the last 17 years is really what happened at the very beginning. In 2000, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act made 2 camps. It established laws and definitions around sex trafficking and labor trafficking. So we have this bifurcation of human trafficking in these 2 camps, and often they're at odds with one another. And there's maybe this Olympics of which one is worse. And I think that actually does a disservice to the human trafficking field as a whole, and maybe we should be focusing on all of human trafficking instead of one camp or the other. That then has also resulted in a sympathy deficit for labor trafficking. There's a very moral response and a heartstring response when we think about sex trafficking and people being sexually abused, and that's not a bad thing, that's a good thing, but sometimes, and has been happening at the expense of having any sympathy for labor trafficking. We don't necessarily have that gut-wrenching moral response to labor trafficking, and how can we rectify that sympathy deficit? We also have seen a conflation between human smuggling and human trafficking. I saw this all the time in Texas. I had reporters calling me on a regular basis. We're like, we just heard this report about 60 Chinese immigrants working, living in a basement in some house, some suburban house. Let's talk about that human trafficking situation. I'm like, I don't hear human trafficking in that explanation. I hear there's a human smuggling incident. There's people who may be on the way to living out a human trafficking situation, but they're not there yet. And so that has made a challenge, and the media doesn't do me any favors in talking about human trafficking and human smuggling at the same time. We also see a conflation between prostitution and sex trafficking. There are kind of 2 big camps. There's the camp that says all prostitution is sex trafficking and is a form of exploitation. And then you have, on the other side, a movement of sex worker rights and sex workers who want to be seen as workers. They want to be seen as a part of the economy, and that they're making a choice to be involved in the commercial sex industry. And so that has been a challenge to overcome. We also have a political climate around immigration that I foresee making it more challenging for trafficking victims to be identified, especially foreign nationals, and them being afraid to come forward or report any of the crimes that are being committed. And so that's going to be something that needs to be addressed. There's an opportunity for more survivor leadership in the anti-trafficking space. There's a need for it. There's a need for their voice to be an equal participant in policy-making decisions around human trafficking. They are experts in their own right. They have their experience to add, and there's a need to treat them as professionals and equal partners. We also have a major opportunity in the anti-trafficking field around the Sustainable Development Goals, specifically 8.7, that has been put forth by the UN. For the first time, really, the UN is addressing human trafficking with Sustainable Development Goal 8.7 in a major way, but we're being told they don't really know what to do. And so they're looking to the anti-trafficking leaders to provide advice and information on how to address human trafficking globally and in countries across the globe individually, and what kind of funding streams and policy should be put in place to address this issue. I think they have a pretty major goal to eradicate human trafficking with this SDG. So how do we get involved and be part of those conversations? And with that, I turn it over to questions.
We'll now have time for questions and answers. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand, and Sarah or I will come to you.
Hi, thank you for coming. And my question is simply, is there a significant proportion of human trafficking victims who are victims of both labor and sex trafficking? And if so, how big is that proportion?
Yes. Well, the answer is yes. There are absolutely people who are victims of both labor and sex trafficking. I would say it's not the majority of that portion, but it is a portion of the victim population. I don't know, I don't have a specific number for you because it's really hard to get that number, but we're definitely seeing it.
Hi, thank you for coming. The pie chart you showed had the statistics for men and women. How is the trans community affected by this?
They are very vulnerable to this crime, actually, and we're not doing a good job at even adding that to that pie chart, right? We should be. Yeah, no, it's definitely an issue. The trans community is very much a vulnerable population, just in terms of the difficulties and obtaining employment, and the stigmatization, just the stigma that they experience lends them to be very vulnerable. We saw that issue in a pretty big way, a pretty significant way in Houston. So that definitely needs to be something that we are doing a better job at addressing. And unfortunately, on the victim services side, it's even more difficult because there's not a lot of service provision that's available for transgender community.
Hi, thanks for coming. I'm actually from Colorado, so it's kind of nice to see another Coloradan. I had a question about the intersection between homelessness and trafficking, because it seems like those two usually go hand in hand. One's kind of a gateway to the other. What kind of work are you doing with the other networks of organizations out there to get that kind of awareness out at, I don't know, the homeless shelter level or even beyond?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. There is very much an intersection between homelessness and human trafficking, and one of the reasons, a big thing is a vast majority of homeless are actually part of the LGBT community, and so that adds an extra layer of vulnerability for that community. There has been interesting things that have happened. There was actually an entire trafficking situation uncovered by a homeless shelter in North Carolina because they changed their intake system to ask questions about previous employment, which is how this person then said, oh, well, I had this job working on this farm, this orange grove, but I was kind of forced to work there, and so they uncovered this entire crime. So actually the homeless community is a major stakeholder in the anti-trafficking field that we need to do a better job at engaging. And actually we're in Colorado, we're going to be addressing standards for housing programs, and I'm very interested in inviting the Coalition for the Homeless or some other organizations to be part of that conversation, because I think they play an important role in identifying human trafficking, but also providing housing services for human trafficking victims as well.
Hi, thank you a lot for your talk. I just had a question about the statistics that you put up just now. One of it that you didn't touch on was that 10% of the victims are state imposed. I was just wondering if you could explain a bit on what that meant.
Yes, we were actually talking a little bit about that at our table. There was actually an interesting article that just came out this morning about a situation in Colorado, and there is a lawsuit just got granted class action for a privately owned immigration detention center is being accused of forced labor and labor trafficking, in that the immigrants that are being detained at the detention center are being asked to voluntarily participate in the work program, but if they don't volunteer to participate in the work program, then they are subjugated to solitary confinement. So they're arguing that that violates the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and that you cannot force immigration detainees into a workplace program. And so they just got granted class action. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. It's actually happening in Colorado. So we'll see how that plays out. But that would be an example of a state-run form of human trafficking, if they win. It's all just accusation right now.
Great talk, Maria. I have a question about the public schools. I could see a situation where the adult trafficked victims and their children. They're required to be in school, so there's a truancy issue there. And how do the schools interact with your group to help, I don't know how you would word it, but fix the problem with the kids not going to school, and then if they do go to school, the kids don't talk about what their parents do. It seems like there should be a situation with truancy officers and so forth there.
Yeah, no, I agree. Educators, I think, are really important in being trained on the issue of human trafficking because they spend so much more time with our children than most people, and they are really able to identify potential situations and can see a lot of things that most of us wouldn't see. So when I train educators, I talk about truancy as being one of those red flags, and why is there truancy, what is happening. In a lot of states, including Colorado, human trafficking has been added to the child abuse and neglect laws and is now part of the mandatory reporting requirements for educators as well as many other mandatory reporters. So I think one of the pieces is just educating educators on the signs of human trafficking and how to report, how to identify, how to engage with that person so they feel safe and can feel like they could disclose to their teacher. And the Department of Education has actually put a lot of guidance out to public schools about how to address human trafficking in the schools. And I'm actually going to have an opportunity to address the National School Board Association about human trafficking and how they could potentially set up protocols and systems in place with their school resource officers, their counselors, their teachers, and create a full range of service, like a service system to address human trafficking in the school system.
Thank you for your talk. I've actually heard that the Super Bowl event is like the largest human trafficking event in the United States, and I was just wondering if you knew anything about that, and if there are any programs set in place to kind of prevent that, knowing that it is one of the largest.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion as like, is that really true? Is it not true? Sports Illustrated actually did an article this last Super Bowl discussing that very issue and kind of weighing the different aspects. And I would say, is it the largest time for human trafficking? I don't know. Is a lot of human trafficking happening during the Super Bowl, specifically sex trafficking? Sure, absolutely. And every city for several years now has actually had a specific effort to address human trafficking during the Super Bowl. So actually, the Super Bowl was in Houston this last year, and so before I left, I started setting the wheels in motion to address human trafficking specifically around the Super Bowl and what that could look like, and helped advise the mayor on creating a plan of action. And so we've seen that in every single city for probably the last 5 or 6 years, that they've created a plan. They're doing a really good job. I think the Sports Illustrated article argued, is there really more incidents of human trafficking, or is there a more organized and concerted effort to address human trafficking in the Super Bowl, because people know that that's a time where you're going to have activity. You have human trafficking activity at any kind of major sporting event. The NBA, the March Madness is coming, during the NCAA finals, any national convention, both political parties, all those types of things are major opportunities to address human trafficking. So I think if you have a full-time concerted effort to address human trafficking every day, you may have the same exact results that you would when you address human trafficking on the Super Bowl.
Hi there. Thank you so much for your talk. Something that intrigued me was your discussion about dualities, like the difference between human smuggling and human trafficking, the difference between prostitution and sex trafficking. I wanted to ask you about the duality of technology and social media. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like there are two camps. Like on the one side, it can kind of make certain communities like more vulnerable and could be like an avenue for forceful recruitment, but at the same time, it can also be a great resource in terms of collaboration, creating these alliances. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the role of social media in, in addressing human trafficking.
Yeah, that's a great question. Technology has done both of those things. I would say that with the advent of the internet has allowed the commercial sex marketplace to be online, and that tradition, and allow for more people to participate, because you get to participate in the comfort of your own home, like under closed windows and shut doors. You don't have to you don't have that embarrassment of going to the track or that exotic video store at the corner, and so allows people to really do a lot of that in a hidden way, and it has, I would actually argue, allowed for that industry to really flourish and grow, because you have so many different sites that are selling the services of human beings. And then you also have social media being an incredible tool for recruiters, for traffickers to recruit their victims. Facebook, Snapchat, anything that anyone is on, traffickers are on there as well, and they are busy fishing and catching their prey through social media, creating those trusting relationships, or what people think as trusting relationships, and it's a huge place where recruitment is happening. On the flip side, law enforcement knows about these sites too, and they're on them as well, and they're using technology. Ashton Kutcher's foundation has funded Thorn, and they're all about using technology as a way to address and combat human trafficking, and scour those different sites and find information to help establish leads for investigations on human trafficking. So there is absolutely two sides to that coin, and technology isn't going to go away, so I think we just have to continue to also use technology to try to fight human trafficking as well.
This will be our last question.
Thank you for your speech. I'm glad that you brought up the issue of minors and consent. I know that legally minors, you can't consent to sex until age 18, so then how can we prosecute underage children for this activity? But I'm curious as to what other paradigms you've had to overcome working with law enforcement. What other bad attitudes or misconceptions have you had to push back against?
Yeah, I mean, I think just the idea that, I mean, one of the big things is just overcoming that these are people who are actual victims of a crime and not people that are voluntarily engaging in criminal activity. And that's still a big debate. You know, I think it's really hard to, it's hard, you know, you have people who are engaging in criminal activity, so that's part of your job, is enforcing laws, but how can you then dig a little bit deeper and understand that maybe this person is actually engaging in this criminal activity because they're forced to? And that's not just within the trafficking piece, but also all the things surrounding it. And, you know, you can have people engaging in shoplifting or identity theft, or maybe they're involved in an assault, and this all could be coerced and forced, have these people forced to do that. And so I think that's a big challenge. Also, just prioritizing human trafficking, that's still a challenge, you know. And I understand law enforcement they have an incredibly difficult job, and they have to enforce the laws and investigate all these different crimes. And human trafficking investigations are incredibly complicated. You often don't have a willing victim or someone who's willing to give you upfront information or even wants to have anything to do with you or give you any kind of honest answers. And so they're tough, they're long. They're not investigations that end at the hour like Law and Order on a nice tight little bow. You know, these are investigations that often take 6 months to a year of hard work and dedication, and not everyone wants to do that. They're not, and you have, and throughout this whole time, you have someone who's a victim who doesn't really want anything to do with you and might be kicking and screaming through the whole entire process. So I think that's a big challenge, to try to encourage law enforcement to prioritize, to dedicate people, and also you don't have the numbers, right? We have some numbers, we don't have great numbers, so when I'm talking to a chief of police or a sheriff, that's their bottom line. They're like, tell me the numbers. Tell me why I should invest in this crime and not others. Because I have, 20 different homicides and assaults. I have numbers for all these other crimes, and I need to investigate those things. You're telling me that you know of 2 cases? Well, I only know 2 cases because those are only 2 cases that were investigated. I'm pretty sure there's like another 100 underneath that, but I don't have the proof. And so that's a really hard thing to come up with, is like the case for investigating and prioritizing is really difficult.
Please join me in thanking Maria Trujillo.
Thank you.